Welcome, and one more welcome to everybody out there for joining us for our continuing series where we interview professors, reporters, writers, columnists, activists, anybody on the left, anybody on the right, as long as people have thoughtful perspectives, and we want to provide them unedited and unaltered directly to you so that you could do this thing that was popular when I was in high school called thinking for yourself. With us today is Frances Lee. She's a professor of politics and public affairs at Princeton. She's also a big name in the field of political polarization. She's been referenced by many of the other people that I've interviewed, so it is a big treat to have her here today. She's jointly appointed in the Department of Politics and the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs, where she is a professor of politics and public affairs. One second, let me check something real quick. Okay. Lee has broad interest in American politics with a special focus on congressional politics, national policymaking, party politics, and representation. She's the author of Insecure Majorities, Congress and the Perpetual Campaign, and Beyond Ideology, Politics, Principles, and Partisanship in the U.S. Senate. She's also co-author of Sizing Up the Senate, The Unequal Consequences of Equal Representation, and a textbook, Congress and its Members. Her research has appeared in the American Political Science Review, American Journal of Political Science, Perspectives on Politics, Journal of Politics, Legislative Studies Quarterly, and other outlets. She's also editor of the Cambridge Elements series in American Politics and a series editor for the Chicago Studies in American Politics, and she's been co-editor of the Legislative Studies Quarterly from 2014 to 2019. She earned her BA from the University of Southern Mississippi and her PhD from Vanderbilt University. She's also a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She's also chair in congressional policymaking from the John W. Klug Center, Library of Congress. She also won an award from the Barbara Sinclair Lectureship on the American Political Science Association, Distinguished Scholar Teacher, University of Maryland, the D.B. Hardiman Prize, the Richard F. Fino Jr. Award, the Stigler Award, APSA Congressional Fellowship Award, the D.B. Hardiman Prize again, and the E.E. Schatzschneider Award, 1998. Some of the work that we've already covered: Can American Govern Itself, Insecure Majorities, the Oxford Handbook of American Congress, Beyond Ideology, Sizing Up the Senate. So the professor's very well experienced at studying Congress, the Senate, House of Representatives, and this is what led us to this book, which is where I found her. But before we do that, let's check in and see how well we did. Professor, did I say anything wrong? Is there something I need to correct? Did I mispronounce anything?
Nothing wrong. You certainly covered a lot of my bio, and that's great.
Okay. To get right to the meat and potatoes, I was interviewing people on political polarization, and many of them said, "You have got to read this book." And so I did. I got the book, I read it, and I have lots of questions about it. But before we get to that, why did you write this book? Why did you write it when you wrote it? And before you answer, if you could also talk as an academic and just somebody who's living in America at this times, as if I've been in a cave for 5 years. What's going on in America? Is polarization an issue? Why did this book seem like a good idea? What was it responding to? What were the issues that you were trying to look at and you thought, oh, this is what I need to write about at this now? Why was this an important issue, and why did you choose to write about it at this time?
Well, I'd been thinking about the motives for members of Congress to behave in partisan ways, to work with their parties, to undercut the reputation of the opposing party, to define themselves against the opposing party, to think about the logic of partisanship. I'd been working on that since having served as a congressional fellow on Capitol Hill during the Bush administration. So my first book that came out of that experience as a congressional fellow was Beyond Ideology, which looked at the political motives for partisan conflict in Congress, separate from the fact that Republicans tend to be conservatives and Democrats tend to be liberals. In other words, it's not all philosophical differences between the parties that produces the level of party conflict that we've seen. That grew out of my time as a fellow, where I observed that it didn't seem to matter what the issue was. and whether you were able to identify what the philosophical stakes might be in terms of what defines a liberal versus a conservative. It didn't matter, that it still broke down on party lines. So why was conflict in Congress so rigidly partisan? So that was the first book. And the logic that I laid out in that book was sort of enduring. There were always reasons why you'd expect parties to work together work together internally and to come into conflict with the opposition. Looking at the logic I identified in that book. And so I wanted to understand why it's so much more partisan now. What caused the increase? And in thinking that through and spending a lot of time just studying the roll call votes that members of Congress cast, and also demand, how do they set the floor agenda, what do they decide to take votes on. Just studying that, I had sort of an aha moment. I remember when it happened, when I thought to myself, the logic differs in this contemporary era post Reagan, where um, the party in power holds office insecurely, that the party in power sees a threat from the out party, and the out party believes it has a pathway in. It's very different um, from a Congress, like was the case through much of the 20th century, before 1980 and after the New Deal, after 1932, where the Democrats were the dominant party in Congress. They had majorities almost all the time. Republicans didn't believe they could become a majority party through much of that time period, and Democrats were not worried about losing it. That's an environment that where it's easier to work across party lines, because you're not looking to position yourself against the opposition to set up issues on a national basis for the upcoming election. So there was just less orientation towards those next elections, less concern about what would happen. The elections were much less nationalized, because it just didn't matter to the country as a whole, for example, which party won those seats in Georgia. Whereas, of course, the Senate seats in Georgia determined, which party would have a majority in the Senate in 2020. And in periods where you've got um, close majorities, narrow majorities, where it's a toss-up, either party could win. Politics is sort of balanced on a knife's edge. Under those circumstances, the focus is very much on the national stakes. Who's going to have a majority in the next elections, and that creates more incentive for the parties to stick together, and also to define issues where they can say, we are a better alternative to the other guys. Why should you support us and not the other party? Well, here are the reasons. And so it's a more confrontational style of partisanship in a more competitive era. And that's basically what we've seen. Since 1980, the Senate has been in play. And since 1994, the House has been in play. And so to think about that logic as helping to understand why our contemporary politics is as conflictual as it is and as partisan as it is.
Just for everyone at home, as Democrats and Republicans continue to vie for political advantage, Congress remains paralyzed by partisan conflict. The last 2 decades have seen some of the least productive Congresses in recent history, is usually explained by the growing ideological gulf between the parties. But this explanation misses another fundamental factor influencing the dynamic. In contrast to politics through most of the 20th century, the contemporary Democratic and Republican parties compete for control of Congress at relative parity. And this has dramatically changed the party's incentives and strategies in a way that has driven contentious partisanship characteristic of contemporary American politics. That there seems to be a lot of evidence for what you're saying. I was wondering if you could explain, maybe that's too small, but there was this one chart I really liked. Let me see if I can adjust that. I was hoping you could explain this one chart, if I can get this modified correctly. Oops. It won't do it. I don't know if you can see this chart. It's divergence from partisan parity 1861 to 2016, and a protracted era of partisan parity. And so I think what you're showing here is there was a lot of partisanship for most of the U.S. history, and there were brief periods where we didn't. I could be wrong on that. Are you able to see the chart? Is it too
Yes,
small?
I'm happy to explain that. So,
Please, please.
That chart rests on a simple set of averages. So uh, for each election year, I average together the share of the two-party vote that the Democratic Party candidate received for president, the share of Senate seats Democrats hold, and the share of House seats Democrats hold. So, how many seats do so in other words, Democratic Party strength nationally. So I average those three together, and that gives me a gauge of not just uh, not just the support of the Democrats receive in any particular institution, but overall. So it gives us a sense of the partisan balance. And then I take the difference from zero, and so I can show periods where one party is more dominant than the other. So I'm just displaying partisan dominance. And in this figure, I'm displaying the that's average across decades. And so you can see in that post Civil War period, the first half the figure, the empty
Yeah,
or
the empty blank squares on the
the
far
empty
left.
bars, yes.
Yeah.
So that shows you periods of Republican dominance
Okay.
where Democrats did very poorly, and so the Demo so were- there were so Repub so if, this is difference from zero. Democrats did very poorly across those three indicators: share of the vote for president, share of Senate seats, share of House seats. So it was a Republican era
Okay.
before the Civil War. Before the New Deal, after the Civil War.
Right.
After the New Deal, Democrats dominate until you get to the contemporary era where neither party dominates. So, you've got a very close balance across those three institutions: the president, the House, and the Senate. Where Democrats don't have much of a advantage over Republicans and vice versa. So it's just a way of sort of visualizing the competitiveness of the political system. And so you just see its parity. There were some previous eras. So you look at the 1880s.
1910 to 1950s.
Yes, those were closely competitive eras as well. They were short though,
Right.
and they're really different from the contemporary period where we've had knife's edge politics, closely competitive politics, the whole time since 1980. And so, it's a fiercely competitive political system, and that's not what I want. The point I want to make from that in the book is that that's not normal for U.S. history.
Right. Right. So just for everybody following along, because we like to take academic stuff and make it available for the basic user in America, the empty boxes on the left represent the Democrats are running the show. And that goes from
No, no, I'm
1860.
sorry. I'm sorry. The Democrats are not running the show in that first. That's Republicans running the show
I'm
after the
sorry.
Civil War.
Thank
Yeah,
you, thank you, thank you. I'm sorry. Thank you,
yeah.
thank you, thank you. The
Mhm.
blank boxes, sorry, the blank boxes represent the Republicans running the show, roughly from 1860 to 1920. The black boxes starting in the 1930s and going to the 1970s show periods of majority Democratic control. And what's unusual since the 1860s to the 2010s, I believe you're saying, Professor, is these periods of intense competition. They were brief. There was a brief one in the 1880s, and then it disappeared, and a brief one in the 1910s, and then it disappeared, and the brief one in the 1950s, and then it disappeared. And now our problem is it's just staying. It's not a brief period. It just goes and it keeps going and it keeps going and it keeps going. In the past, we'd see a brief period and then it'd be knocked out of it. Now we're 4 terms in of this same hyperpolarization election, and that's just dysfunctional for a functional federal government. Is that roughly correct?
That's right. And it's not 4 terms, it's 4 decades now and
4
still
decades.
going. 4
4
decades and still going. And so it's our polarized era is also a fiercely competitive era, and those things are connected. And so I don't think you can understand the intense polarization that we see without also recognizing that the rivalry between the parties is as intense as it is.
And we've never seen this period of 4 decades going on of intense polarization before in American history. So this is new. This is new.
Right.
Okay. And say the last thing you said again, please.
So it's a rivalry
Right.
that gets driven by this close competition. That the parties in that sense aren't necessarily different from other organizations that are engaged in close competition. That this rivalry drives some of that animosity that we see between Republicans and Democrats in this current era.
And so if we had a return to an era where one party is clearly dominant, we might see a reduction in political polarization?
I think you would, yes.
Okay. I want to read a quote from the book, if I may.
Sure.
Scholars have tended to attribute increased party conflict to ideological polarization. This is on page 200. Meaning a widening philosophical gap between the two parties. There is no question that the parties in Congress are indeed more ideologically distinct today than they were in much of the 20th century. The causes of this phenomenon are not well understood, however. Polarization in Congress does not seem to have been driven by voters moving to the ideological polls, though voters became better sorted by ideology in response to the cues. Regional realignment has unquestionably made the parties much more ideologically cohesive internally and more differentiated from one another. In particular, the realignment of white Southerners into the Republican Party made Republicans more uniformly conservative and Democrats more uniformly liberal. However, the regional sorting of the parties cannot begin to account for the full extent of increased partisanship of Congress because growing differences between the parties extend throughout the whole country. So I think what you're saying is other people are saying, oh, it's ideological polarization, it's the media, it's social media, it's Donald Trump. And I think what you're doing is you're taking a long view and going, if we take a step back and look over the last 100 years, this really seems to be a systemic problem. And it really is about American democracy kind of works best when one party really is dominant. We have this idea of it needs to be a grudge match and someone barely wins every time, but that's just because that's what we've seen over the last 4 decades. If you really look at America, it functioned better with kind of one dominant party and one minority party. Is that roughly accurate?
Right. Yes. I think, when you have a circumstance where the parties are so evenly matched, it focuses them on politics and on questions of political advantage in ways that are less center stage in a less competitive system. Note also that what it means when one party dominates, it means the American people have a strong preference. And that so the American people, in some sense, have sort of decided. And they have given a mandate, if you will, or at least the reins of power to one party. They withhold that in this closely competitive era. A party might get unified government, meaning control of both the presidency, the House, and the Senate in recent years, but they can only hold it for 2 years before there's a backlash. Voters are not happy with either party. And so neither party has shown itself able to win an enduring majority. And so I think that also reflects the challenges of governing in this era because the American people are dissatisfied with their alternatives.
I remember they were talking about Dwight Eisenhower, and he became president. And they said, see, there's a Republican president. But he came after when it was the Democrats were largely in control. And one of the things I found interesting was they're saying, well, yeah, he's a Republican, and yeah, he's a military guy, and he kind of thought that way. But a lot of fellow Republicans were angry with Eisenhower because they wanted him to attack the New Deal. And Eisenhower basically said, the New Deal is part of America. Like, I'm going to do other conservative stuff. I'm not going to go take down the New Deal because that's who we are as Americans. And he kind of accepted that and moved forward. And you look at Reagan. Reagan had to do a lot of compromising with Tip O'Neill in order to get legislation passed. And so there does seem to be this pattern of strong presidents coming, but kind of recognizing the mood of the country. But I think now you're saying we're getting to, who cares what the mood of the country is? I'm about my party.
Well, there isn't. It's hard to even say what the mood of the country is when you've got election outcomes as narrowly decided as they are.
That's
presidents barely win. Somebody has to win, but it's close, and so there's little sense that the American people have spoken and have indicated what they want. Elections don't convey that kind of meaning when they're so narrowly decided.
So voters end up feeling like they haven't been heard.
Right. They feel like they haven't been heard, but it's also because the voters themselves are so divided that they don't send a clear message to Washington.
I think you're also saying that this is the cause for polarization, at least at congressionally and at the elite level. But you are saying the average voters are somewhat ideologically sorted, but that's not the reason for the polarization. But you're not denying there is kind of a sort, and people seem a lot more angry at each other across parties. That's fair to say?
Yes, that's right. And I think first of all, what you can see is if you study polarization in the electorate and polarization in Congress, you can see that polarization in Congress happened before polarization in the electorate. And it's much more complete in Congress than it is in the electorate. The American people are not nearly as partisan as their elected representatives are. So I think that sort of undercuts the idea that what the level of partisanship that we see in Congress is just, following what the American people are asking for, if you will. That it's not, it does more than merely reflect. I think, one of the reasons why there is so much partisan animosity among voters, why Republicans don't want to see their children marry Democrats and vice versa.
Thank you.
They don't want to see that because they've received messages from elites for decades now about why the other party is bad and why the other party would do harm to the country if they gained power. Like they've received, a steady diet of harsh rhetoric, denouncing the opposing party throughout all of this closely competitive period. And so, I think you can't understand the animosity in the electorate without taking stock of the close competition between the parties and what that does to political incentives in among our elected representatives. Like they're constantly attacking the opposition. I have a chapter in the book on party message operations. They've built up all these offices and hired all these staffers who work on Capitol, whose job it is to come up with partisan attacks. And so then that disseminates out to the public. And so the public, receives these messages, and that reinforces them in their partisanship, makes them dislike the opposition even more.
I've seen the studies saying it was, I think, 2012, it was like 30% of Americans wouldn't date someone outside of the party. And you go back to like over, I think, 2016, 2017, and it jumps to 55%. So it's now more than half of Americans won't date someone outside of the party. They also won't marry. There's also evidence, I think, covered by the Atlantic magazine on school segregation by politics. I've also interviewed a lot of people, many different states, where they're saying, I lost friends, I lost family. There's people I can't talk to anymore. And it was not like that before Trump. But I never bought the America was perfect and great and there was no problems. And then Trump came and single-handedly broke it all by himself. I'm like, there had to be things going on. And so I like this theory because you're going, no, go back. Trump did not start 4 decades ago. The ground was being seeded by other people. Politicians were being, I think what you're saying is, and tell me if I'm wrong, the elections are so close. So you really got to eke out a win. And hey, it's nice to go, I'm going to run a clean election and be a moral good guy. But when it gets close and push comes to shove and it's, are we going to win or lose? Dirty tricks are now back on the table.
It's a
Ideology.
dogfight.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yep.
So, hey, I got to, my plan for welfare reform and healthcare reform isn't activating the voters enough. I need to now start dog whistling ideology in order to eke out that win. Or I guess we just lose and we go home. And they don't want to do that. And so they're doing this, and they've been doing it, unfortunately, for about 4 decades. And eventually that idea just bubbles up in people's minds. That's all they hear. The other side's evil, horrible. If we lose to them, it's the end of America. The moon is going to crash into the earth. And, you hear this for 2-3 generations, you start to internalize it. Is that roughly what you're saying?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. How many times have we heard that this is the most important election of our lives? We hear that every time. And it's because they are doing everything they can to excite the voters to side with them. And so it's a very overheated political environment, in great part because it is such a closely competitive political environment.
So my 2 questions for you would be, is it possible to get America back to where one party's dominant, like we had for the longest time? And the other one that's related is, if it is or is not possible, let's say you had a magic wand. This is a game I always play. Let's say you had a magic wand. You could do this. Poof. Anything you want happens. You have this magic wand. You have the ability to get everyone in Congress to start behaving whatever way you think is correct. How long to deprogram the American people, since it's taken 4 decades to get them this angry? Could we just, poof, I struck my wand. Everybody in AOC's hugging Donald Trump, and 2 weeks later, everybody in America forgets this built up anger? Or are we looking at now something that's been so built and so cooked for so long, it's going to take generations to get out of? Which one, Professor?
It's a very self-reinforcing dynamic, for sure. It's hard to break out of the logic that we've seen in American politics over the past 4 decades. That if we look back at that chart that you've displayed, what we see is that long-term eras of one-party dominance follow major crises. So the Republican dominance after the Civil War owes a great deal to the Civil War itself. That the Democratic Party for a long time after the Civil War was seen as a Southern party, and the Southern party was the party of rebellion. After 1932, the Great Depression begins with Republicans in power, and that's very discrediting of them. And so it was very hard for them to build back trust after the economy just coming apart on their watch. So these huge crises in American politics are at the root of those long stretches of one-party dominance. Now, am I wishing for a crisis of that kind of scale? No, I wouldn't. But that does seem to be about what it takes to create a real lasting advantage for one party. Or it's hard to generalize. We've got more than a century to look at, but we only have 2 lengthy periods of one party dominance. First the Republicans, long stretch, and then Democrats, long stretch. So you're sort of pushing at the limits of what I can gain insight into from our historical record. Broad brush,
Broad brush.
I'd characterize a period of one-party dominance as growing out of a crisis of some kind, and so it's hard to wish for something like that. But short of the American people sort of choosing between the parties, I mean, that's basically what we had under those long stretches of one-party dominance. You had an American electorate that in a persistent way preferred one party to the other.
Right.
And what we have we just have not seen that in the contemporary era. The 2 parties are pretty evenly matched, and the American people swing a bit and adjust enough. That red state, blue state map that we've seen since the 2000 presidential election. So we've
Mhm.
had, more than 20 years of that landscape. That that means that not very many voters can decide who becomes the president. That is
Right.
just small swings in a
Thank you.
few swing states
Hmm.
determine the outcome. And so under those circumstances, neither party is secure in power. That's why I call my book Insecure Majorities. It's true of the presidency as well. And so they'd have to just keep fighting it out in a landscape like that until the American people at some level have a preference for one party over the other that lasts. I think we're stuck.
Okay. Let me ask you maybe a potentially difficult question, maybe not. You were talking about how in the past there was the Civil War, and then the Republicans handled that better than the Democrats, and the American people said, you know what, you have the right vision for the country for a while, and then we had the New Deal, and Roosevelt pushed that through, and people said, you know what, you Democrats have the right vision for America, and now we're at a position where there's no preference for either party. And you were saying, well, how did the dominance happen before? Well, there was a major crisis, and then one party, I guess, responded better than the other, and there was a preference. And what worries me is that we've had three major crises, and no party has risen to the top. We had the terrorist attack, the first time we were attacked on our soil ever, outside of Pearl Harbor, I think. And if you really want, you could really say ever since 1812. The 2008 global economic recession, we hadn't seen something like that since the 1930s. And then we had the COVID pandemic. We hadn't seen something like that since the 1916 Spanish flu. That did not result in either party running to the top. Still is polarized now. And so my question to you is, given that it's been 4 decades and that the previous periods were only 1 decade long, and now we're in a period of 4 times that, is it possible that we just never return to one party dominance?
It's certainly possible. It's certainly possible. Another alternative is that a new party arises.
A third
Um,
party.
yeah, a new party. It's possible. I mean, the Republican Party was a new party formed just before the Civil War and then became one of our 2 major parties. So, big change can happen. I wouldn't rule it out, but it's hard to foresee it. Right now, it seems that all the incentives push towards stasis and push towards a continuation of the politics that we currently see. I can't see around the corner.
Right.
What would change it?
Right. I just wonder because I love maps, I love charts, and I love patterns. And this very clearly is saying the period of hyperpartisanship is a fluke. It's a blip. It's a abnormality. It happens, and then we go back to kind of our normal pattern. And it's been that way for over a century. And now we're in decade 1, decade 2, decade 3, decade 4. This thing normally ends after 10 years. We're 400% in. Maybe it broke the mold. That's what I'm
Could
thinking of. Maybe it
It's
broke the
very
mold.
possible. Yeah, it's very possible. It's interesting though. This coexists with a lot of one-party dominance at the state level. So there are many states that are governed by one party in an enduring way. Um, and yet at the national level, the parties are evenly matched, and it's sort of mysterious to think about. How do you add up 50 states, many of which are safe for one party and are really controlled by one party at the state level, and produce this even competition nationally? But it is what we have.
That is bizarre. I didn't know that. So that's a good point. I have seen that. I never put that together until you just said that. So there are states like California. It's one party dominant, whether you like it or not. And it's been that way for a lot since Schwarzenegger was governor. So it's been a while. And then there's other places like that. And then yet we don't have that at the national level. So we still have these states dominated by one party, but we never could get back to the nation being dominated by one party. That is a weird difference. That is bizarre.
Mhm.
Any theories why that might be? I'm not
I
asking
don't.
for
I just.
an
I
answer.
do not. I don't know. I've thought a lot about it. For me, it's very hard to figure out how these things can coexist.
That is bizarre. That is bizarre. Okay, haven't heard of that before. So we need to have a third party or maybe some new type of an emergency that one party does well, and that would get us theoretically back to the part of our traditional pattern of one party being in dominance.
Potentially. I mean, that
Potentially.
we don't have, like I said, we don't have many cases to work with before. You know, you had the Civil War crisis and you had the Great Depression. Um, and you know, that seemed to be very important for shaping the electoral landscapes for long periods afterwards. But you know, what would it take to do that again? It's hard to say. I wish I could give you a better answer, one that could give you a sense of exactly what to look for. But um,
You're doing
it's
perfect. You're doing
yeah.
perfect. Well, that's what these interviews are for, is not for my opinion, but for the viewers to see this and go, this is how far the science has gone. And they don't have an answer for everything. And here's some of the remaining questions. And here's what we do know, and here's what we don't know. So everyone can follow along. And I like the fact that you're saying, here's what we know, and here's what we don't know. And we took it this far. There's still more questions. It's a big problem. Not everyone has every aspect of it figured out. We're still figuring it out, and we're the top people researching it. And we're still occasionally going, I don't know. It's bad, and then, well, that's not a metric, but I think that's refreshing to see that honesty. So I appreciate that. Let's assume one party never comes back to be dominant. It's still hyperpartisan, barely winning elections. If we've been doing this for 4 decades, and that's been encouraging the elites to say, this is the most important election ever, like you say, and the other side's the bad guys. And all that's gotten is us to get people so angry that they'll do something like January 6th. Can I imagine that if this doesn't get fixed, we're just looking forward to a future of increased citizen polarization?
I mean, nothing about our current politics has dialed down the harshness of the political rhetoric that Americans are hearing. In fact, in our news landscape, it's become much easier for people to stay siloed into information streams that reinforce their biases. You know, you get Democratic news sources and Republican news sources now. So, so much about the political system reinforces these existing patterns. One thing that I would say that can disrupt them
Please.
it's not to say that you mentioned the crises, the financial crisis, you mentioned 9/11, and you mentioned COVID. Each of those crises gave rise to major legislation in Congress that was passed in a bipartisan way. And so sometimes things just happen in the world that both parties find themselves able to agree enough to work together to respond to that crisis. And so those kinds of disruptions, although they haven't risen to the level of reshaping the electoral landscape, they do reshape the political landscape in Washington for short periods, short bursts of major action.
Right.
And so that kind of punctuation keeps us from being stuck in in just trench warfare, between Republicans and Democrats on domestic policy.
So it's trench warfare with periods of, I think it's called a superordinate threat that brings us all together. Like Ronald Reagan said, if aliens invaded, it'd bring all the humans together. He said that. I'm not endorsing that as a plan. But,
that's an idea of a good crisis that might bring us together, right?
My friend from New York was talking about how Congress held the first official hearings on UFOs this week. They did a 4-hour session. I'm not speaking. That's where it came. I'm not saying, whatever. Watch the movie Prometheus. It's the best of the entire Aliens franchise. That's all I'm going to say. Okay, last questions, Professor. We're winding down. I want to say thank you for your time. Here's my favorite question to ask everybody. You're not you. You're not me. You're a third-party person who's going to watch this video. You don't know who they are, what they're like, what they think. They're watching this video and they say, wow, I learned a lot. I never heard that theory. Boy, does that explain a lot. We went through the charts and they're struggling to remember everything, but they keep saying to themselves, there was this one thing that the professor said, and I struggle to remember all the stuff they were covering, but there was this one thing. It's 5 days after I've watched that video, and I cannot get this one thing the professor said out of my head. What is that one thing you want a random person you'll never meet to not be able to stop thinking about 5 days from now as far as political polarization goes?
I want them to understand that this is a 50-50 country in partisan terms, and it's been that way for a long time, and that reality is very important for understanding our politics. The rivalry between the parties is a rivalry for power that's conducted on an even playing field where either party can win. And that when they hear overheated rhetoric coming from Washington, they need to remember, well, everybody's facing a close competition for power, and take it with a grain of salt. Sort of recognize what game is being played, if you will. Not to say it's a game, it's just merely a game. The stakes are high, but it is a competitive marketplace for ideas, and a competitive political system in which the two parties face off at equal strength. And so, in that kind of context, we should expect a lot of the behavior that we see. It's understandable in light of that. And so, for me, as I think about that reality, it helps me have some empathy for our political leaders in these circumstances. That it's a tough environment that they inhabit, with the high stakes, and they're reacting to the incentives that are created, that are before them, and to sort of understand what the game is, sort of see it from their point of view, and have some distance on it. Don't get caught up in the rhetoric that's just electioneering, that's just campaigning. Sort of understand that. I understand what the game is, I guess, is what I would say.
Maybe don't assume that they're monsters who just want to rip America apart because they're evil, but they're desperate and they're trying to win.
That's it. That's a very nice way of summing it up. Yes.
Last question. You don't have to say, but we always like to keep the conversation going. Is there anybody maybe they're a professor, maybe they're an activist, someone on the streets, whatever, that might be willing to be part of an honest conversation like we're having here? You don't have to name anybody, but we always ask and try to keep the conversation going.
Well, nobody's jumping to mind just instantly, and I'm not sure who all you have talked to, but I'll give it some thought, and we'll be glad to make some suggestions.
I really appreciate that, Professor. I will email you a copy of the video shortly, and I want to say thank you for your time. I know you're very busy, and I really appreciate you taking time to help explain this theory. It's a novel theory, because everybody's going, it's ideology, it's social media, it's the news, and here, well, hold on, guys, let's take a look here. And look, if you 100 years of data, it kind of says something else. It's a novel approach. I think it's one more people need to hear about, because all we're hearing about is ideology and social media. And if we just got rid of the apps, everything would be perfect. And this kind of says fixing apps on your phone isn't going to snap everything back together, folks. If it's a structural issue like this, we need to be thinking structurally, not what did CNN say and how do we re-regulate news agencies and social media apps. So I find it a unique theory and very important. And I think we should look into it more. There's a lot of it, because I don't see enough people looking at this and going, is that it? Is that not it? Because if this is right, wow, I don't know how you fix a structural situation like that, other than, a third party rises because they handled the crisis, some unforeseen crisis we can't see now, better. So that's, hope for the future. I'll leave it there. Thank you, Professor. I'll email you shortly, and I want to say thank you again for your time.
Thank you.
Take care.